Salvage Union is a rules-light tabletop RPG by Aled Lawler and Penny Lines of Leyline Press. Published in 2023 after a successful Kickstarter, the rules are based on the open-source framework of the RPG called Quest, which essentially calls for a single d20 on any check. But the most notable feature of this game, if you've been keeping up with indie RPGs in the past few years, is that it borrows some thematic elements from the RPG Lancer by Massive Press. I know that there are more mech RPGs out there than just Lancer, but that's one of the highest profile ones out there right now, and since I did review it on my channel a few years back, I wanted to make a couple of obvious comparisons in this video. But just to skip to the chase here, Salvage Union is a different animal altogether. Whereas in Lancer, the lore is heavy and detailed, and mech combat is about 95% of gameplay for anyone who actually plays the game, and mech build options are so complex that you have to use CompCon, an online companion app. Salvage Union is very light on lore, just putting you on a single planet in a post-apocalypse, and mech combat is deeply simplified, even if you do get dozens of mech chassis to choose from, which means playing the game absolutely does not require an online app to build and track your mech loadout. In fact, the rules are so light that they very directly remind me of the OSR style of gameplay, which in its best iteration is trying to give you ideas and inspiration on a thin matrix of rules so that people at the table can use their creativity to solve problems rather than rule-specific mechanics. In other words, this is basically an OSR mech game, a sort of antidote to the mechanistic crunch of Lancer. I'm going to walk you through the whole core rulebook, but first, let's take a quick look at the sponsor for this video, Infaernum, a game which I previewed on this very channel recently. Infaernum is a narrative-driven RPG set in the final days before an apocalypse, inspired by the Book of Revelation, and boasting a distinct visual style reminiscent of Mork Borg. It offers a sandbox experience for GMs and players. Originally an award-winning Brazilian crowdfunding project, it's now available in English via Kickstarter. The game emphasizes solo and co-op play with a ton of optional mechanics enhancing gameplay variety. Character creation is very streamlined, focusing on defining traits like fortune, misfortune, and blessings, allowing for diverse interpretations and settings beyond medieval fantasy. Gameplay revolves around interpreting dice rolls, with dooms, miracles, and torments shaping the narrative. A unique resolution mechanic balances risk and reward, with death lurking for those who roll 3 6s. Those optional rules expand gameplay dramatically, including soul collecting, side quests inside of interdimensional rifts, and Colossus battles, offering GMs flexibility and creativity in crafting their experiences. Explore the Kickstarter campaign to pledge and unleash your creativity into the world of Infaernum. Link is below. Alright, back to Salvage Union. I want to take a minute to flip through the physical books that make up Salvage Union. This is a meaty book, measuring about 7 inches by 9 3/4 inches, but running 337 pages. Leyline Press went with Standard in Lithuania as their printer, so you're getting that same ultra deluxe feeling heavy cover and thick, richly printed paper as you do with Free League, who also uses the same printer. Despite the thickness of this book, the actual mechanics of this game only occupy about 20 pages, so you shouldn't get intimidated by the thickness. At the time of recording, there are 3 official adventure books, and even though they each run only 70 to 80 pages, they're also printed by Standard, so they're absurdly overbuilt in terms of thickness and durability. Rainmaker is an adventure by Luke Gearing, who has a long list of prestigious indie RPG writing credits to his name at this point. This adventure has this really cool premise of players vying for control of an abandoned atmospheric conditioning network, a global storm engine that can create rain wherever they want. I think the biggest point about these adventures, circling back to Lancer comparisons for a minute, is that for adventures in Salvage Union, these cool background details actually matter. The story matters in Salvage Union. It's not just about mechs battling each other in a rock'em sock'em exchange of attrition. Well, there is a bit of that in this game, of course. We Were Here First is an adventure written by Diogo Nogueira, another very accomplished RPG writer and creator, especially renowned in OSR circles, which is not a coincidence considering the nature of Salvage Union's approach to gameplay. This adventure puts players on the path to recovering a material called chimerium, which is extremely valuable, extremely dangerous, and sought after by several regional groups. The material is found in meteors that randomly strike the area. False Flag is an adventure written by the original authors of Salvage Union itself. It puts players on various missions to recover a very valuable nanite dust that resulted from an industrial accident. The most notable feature of this adventure at first glance is that the layout represents Windows or Mac from the 90s, if you're old enough to remember that. Also, if you're wondering why all these adventures seem to center around PCs scrambling to salvage valuable resources, it's because that's what you do in this game, at least primarily. In a vanilla adventure, you're out there in the wastelands, salvaging scrap metal from abandoned and destroyed mechs, as well as bio-titans. We'll go over all that in a minute. You can also get specialty D20s for this game. They come in a pack of 5, which is actually enough for a GM and 4 players, since this is a 1d20 game system. The colors match the theme of the core rulebook, and you get a Salvage Union gear icon for a 20. As I mentioned, the setting of this game is only painted in broad strokes. You could almost just summarize it in a handful of bullet points. Those bullet points would be: it's an apocalypse with the environment having degraded due to human activity. There are lots of deserts and radiation storms. Most people live in arcologies, which are self-sustaining mega buildings. Evil corporations own those arcologies and keep most inhabitants in a state of perpetual debt bondage. Everyone else lives out in the world, living inside of gigantic roaming mechs called union crawlers. Their inhabitants forming so-called salvage unions, co-op societies ranging from a few hundred to tens of thousands in population. And finally, there are smaller mechs. Mechs are everywhere and come in all shapes, sizes, and serve all purposes imaginable. And a few more bullet points. There are giant mutant monsters called bio-titans roaming around. There is an alien presence in the form of nanite goop that lurks on the ground here and there and can take over humans, animals, and machines upon contact. And finally, you're a salvager. You belong to a salvage union, and your ultimate purpose is to contribute to your roaming hometown by gathering resources for it. Character creation in this game is very straightforward. I'm going to gloss over some of the more familiar aspects like hit points and call signs and equipment, and jump to what is undoubtedly the most inspired aspect of character creation and development in this game, and that is the classes. We can start at the center here. When you start off, you choose one of 5 pilot classes. Each of these gives you access to unique abilities that pertain to different play styles. You earn training points and spend them to unlock more and more abilities between missions. And eventually you will gain access to advanced abilities. And this is where it gets really interesting. Each core class can grow to become one of 2 hybrid classes out of a total of 5 hybrid classes. You can also just continue specializing in your core class's ability. And at the end of every track, there are some super powerful legendary abilities. 2 things to note here. One is that PCs can only have up to 10 abilities, and you can unlearn abilities by spending a training point. Let's take a look at just one example of a core pilot class here, the Hacker. You can see their menu of core abilities summarized here, and if you want to further specialize, there are these 3 advanced abilities. By the way, some of these abilities can be used freely, while others cost so-called ability points to use. The AP costs are noted right here in the summary boxes. You also get range and duration icons in a very elegant and clever manner. If you buy your way to the end of the Hacker abilities track, there are 2 legendary abilities to choose from. Each of the abilities in this game are described thoroughly, and despite the game having a light rules system, you're going to find a lot of fun and creative variety in these abilities. One thing I'll note about many of the legendary abilities is that they are ridiculously powerful. The 2 available for the Hacker, for example, allow you to control an entire settlement's network or install permanent spyware into such a network. The legendary abilities for the Hauler include being able to salvage destroyed equipment, which is actually a rather extreme ability that can make your party quite flush with good salvage, because in this game, destroyed equipment usually means it's unrecoverable no matter what. Haulers can also potentially double their mech's structure points, which is like their hit points, as well as its cargo capacity, just by sitting in a mech. I have to mention the core class of Salvager, actually, which is a 6th core class that is a little different from the others. First of all, they have a maximum of 12 abilities instead of 10, and they can choose from all of the core abilities of the other core classes. Their main drawback is that they can't learn any advanced or legendary abilities. As expected, each of those 5 hybrid classes have their own set of core, advanced, and legendary abilities. Check out this graphic on each class page that shows you where you are on the class wheel. A really nice touch. But yeah, as you can see, this game has a total of 10 classes, each with 11 to 14 unique abilities. It's a nice amount of variety, and each of these classes really do cater to very different playstyles without much overlap. The Sniper Hybrid class, for example, has all these great ways to play a sort of assassin from a distance. The custom sniper rifle, camo suit, and wingsuit can make you a very specific kind of operator. And if you train on the legendary teleport beacon, you can literally start teleporting yourself and the rest of your party from place to place. I really love a lot of the abilities described for the different classes, but one that was particularly fascinating to me was a legendary ability for the Cyborg Hybrid class. With Ascension, your character fully uploads themselves into the AI matrix of your Union crawler, and at that point, you appear as a hologram to everyone. You can still pilot a mech, but you do so by remote. I'm just enthralled with the storytelling possibilities here. The core rules for this game aren't presented until towards the end of this book, but I wanted to jump ahead for a minute to cover them. The system is borrowed from the RPG Quest, and it's simple, maybe almost to a fault. You are always rolling only 1d20, and that die result produces either success with a bonus, regular success, a tough choice, failure, or failure plus a setback. This bit right here is important to understanding why this game has such a relatively simplistic dice resolution. Rulings, not rules. That's practically an official mantra for the OSR movement, which is a playstyle that tries to emphasize player creativity in problem solving rather than rules application. But in order to achieve that ideal, a game has to take a step back from predefining every possible outcome. The less resolution there is, to a degree, the more a game will allow room for creative problem solving. Later in the GM section, it becomes crystal clear what kind of game the authors tried to design. They advise GMs to provide as much information as they can to players in order to make the game run smoother, as well as encourage creativity. At this point in the book, I was surprised that I didn't see one of those OSR logos on the cover. It's worth noting that you can re-roll a die if you are in your mech, but you have to accept the second roll as well as take on 2 heat and make a heat check. A heat check is a d20 roll where if the result is equal to or under your mech's current heat, you have to roll on this reactor overload table. In the best case scenario, your mech gets an extra turn or gets a free push. In the worst case scenario, you lose your mech and everything installed on it, as well as deliver damage to everything around you. And if your pilot doesn't have a means of escape, they die and the area becomes irradiated. It takes a full hour of your mech being shut down to vent all heat, and you take double damage when you're shut down. This is probably the biggest difference between this game and something like Lancer, which is more wargamey. Distances. In Salvage Union, there's no grid or hex, you just use one of 4 abstracted ranges, which is to say this game does not place a lot of emphasis on traditional battlefield tactics. This approach isn't good or bad, it's just a style of play. Here's another example of the game being chill on details and just going with the flow. Improvised damage. There's not a predefined formula for every edge case, whether it be falling from a certain distance or taking damage from a crumbling building or taking cover. The GM just needs to wing it. Salvaging is a big part of the game, and every pilot actually has all 8 of these special salvaging abilities. You'd almost want to have a copy of these 2 pages for every player, since they are going to be using these abilities somewhat frequently. There are tech levels assigned to all equipment in this game, including personal equipment that your pilot PC might have. I don't want to get too deep into the equipment available, except to note that a lot of the lower tech equipment is only described in very general terms, and anything that can be used as a weapon is going to have an ability point cost and range, and you occasionally have tools that have different efficacy depending on how much AP you spend. So as you might have expected, you build a personal mech in this game as well, and you do so by spending scrap points, which is rated from Tech 1 to Tech 6. When you start, you have 20 Tech 1 scrap points to spend, and your starting mech chassis or underlying structural framework is also Tech 1. I couldn't help but be reminded of Lancer once again when I got to this part of the book. It's not to say that the guys who wrote Lancer invented energy points and heat capacity for mechs. That stuff's been around in games since the early 80s by my reckoning. But the overall design fundamentals of a mech in this game did provoke me to search the credits of this game to see if the authors cite Lancer as an inspiration. Which is fine, I guess. Maybe they weren't inspired by Lancer at all. But this does remind me of Lancer. Your mech has energy points, which are spent to activate systems, modules, and mech abilities, much like how you use ability points with your pilot. Systems are external hardware on your mech, and you are limited by how many slots your chassis has to accommodate systems. Cargo slots are spaces that you can use to carry extra stuff around, and the default is 6 slots. You need these to carry salvage back to your Union crawler. This is the name of the game by default. Find salvage, bring it back to the crawler while managing to not get killed. Structure points are your mech's hit points, basically. Heat capacity is the limit your mech has before it overheats. You create heat by using systems and modules or pushing your roll. And modules are like systems but internally installed, things like communication devices and reactor mods. Now that I've gone through all that, you can look at a mech spread such as this one for the mule and sort of understand what's going on with the stats. Check out the cargo capacity on this one, for example. It's huge, but alas, the energy points are low and there's hardly any room for modules. Mech loadouts in any game, whether it's an RPG, war game, or video game, are all about trade-offs and customization. Each mech provided in this game comes with 3 suggested loadouts, and a number of those are earmarked as ready for a new player starting at level 1. These so-called patterns are all really nice because they cut down on the amount of decision making and shopping you'd have to do otherwise. There are exactly 30 mechs in the core rulebook for this game with 3 alternate patterns for each. That means you have a lot of coverage in terms of utility and gameplay style. But obviously some of these mechs are simply not available to new characters. A carrier, for example, is a gigantic Tech 5 support crawler. An Eidolon is essentially a stealth killing machine, also Tech 5. The Neurophage is interesting. This one actually meshes with the pilot's brain, and you can spend ability points as if they were energy points. And you can spend the mech's energy points as if they were ability points. As mentioned, mech systems are externally installed pieces of equipment for your mech. Each of those pre-made patterns list certain systems, but you still have to consult these following pages in order to know what those systems actually do and the potential limitations that they have. You can just see from this mastered list that Salvage Union is showing up as a mech RPG, even if the dice resolution is ultra simple. This is a lot of options. I don't want to go into detail on the various systems, but I do want to show you one random sample page so you can see how they are described and presented. The T is the tech level of the system. The number in the triangle is the slots required to install it, and the number in the gear icon is its salvage value. But wait, there's more. Remember, there are internally installed things called modules. You don't get quite as many to choose from as systems, but these tend to be a bit more powerful in a way. Just to give you an idea of how crazy the game might get, let's take a look at the most powerful modules you can buy for your mech. A DDR module allows your mech to dance impressively. Okay, that's not very crazy. Phase matter, though, allows your mech to move through walls, structures, and even other mechs. Reaction protocols basically gives you a number of free attacks per round. Well, not free because you still take on heat, but it does throw the regular turn economy out the window. There is one last thing that you have to build in this game before you can get started, and that's your hometown, which comes in the form of an impossibly huge mech called a crawler. It's got some stats and weapon systems, which is to say it can come under attack and be destroyed. Here's one softer bit I thought was really funny though. It says here, crawlers are communal spaces. There is no direct hierarchy of command. But then 2 paragraphs down it says, you and the other pilots have unilateral control as a group to dictate the direction of the Union crawler in the wastelands and to use the resources you find. Hey, at least it's you and not some NPC. There are 5 crawler archetypes to choose from, each with a couple of unique features of their own. I would have almost rather had a single menu with all of these cool features so that you can mix and match to create your own crawler. Actually, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. Here's a very clear picture of how upgrading your crawler can be problematic even as it increases in structure points. As you go from Tech 1 to Tech 6 with your crawler, upkeep becomes increasingly demanding. If you fail to collect enough upkeep in a given outing, you have to roll on this deterioration table. Your crawler is composed of a number of bays that each have an important function, and when the structure takes damage, one or more of these bays will become damaged and inoperative. You then have to spend downtime and resources to repair it. It's important to keep all the bays functional because your whole union operation will go into a death spiral if you don't. For example, if you take damage to the armament bay, your crawler won't have its main defense weapons. Then the next time it comes under attack, you might lose your med bay, in which case your pilots can't heal during downtime. Each loss of functionality will decrease your overall chances of survival in the long run. The NPCs and enemies section of the game contains 6 kinds of potential foes. Corpos, Wastelanders, and Raiders are pretty self-explanatory, but Biotitans, these are special. These are basically kaiju. One thing I found odd was that PCs can salvage Biotitans as though they were scrap. This really doesn't make a whole lot of sense in game, but I can see why the authors would want to allow some kind of direct reward for defeating one of these things. The kaiju in the book are relatively lavishly illustrated compared to the mechs, and for the most part they have some cool abilities and attacks. By the way, note the structure points on this Scylla, 39. Then note the structure points on this one, 67, which is pretty high if you consider the fact that every time it attacks with the Swallow Whole ability, there's a 5% chance you will lose a mech and pilot instantly. This moth that is apparently the size of a city has even more hit points, which makes sense, but I'm not too happy about this ability here, which potentially gives it full control of its target for up to 24 hours. I'm just not a fan of taking away player agency like that, especially for that long. The hit point bloat gets completely out of hand with this tyrant though. 215 points just sounds like a Dungeons and Dragons style slog. I guess it's not that bad if you have some higher level mechs that can put down some real damage, but this thing is basically Godzilla. Melds are another fascinating enemy presence in the setting. They are made up of countless alien nanites who are all connected to a hive mind that has mysterious goals here on your planet. They move slowly on their own, but like to attach themselves to living creatures and machines and control them. If you can defeat a colony, then the scrap is potentially worth quite a bit. But here's where it gets fun. Melds can attach to mechs and become so-called behemoths. They start with 60 structure points, but actually pick up the max structure points of whatever mech they take over. So they can be pretty formidable. Attack-wise, they aren't terribly dynamic or interesting though, just tendril attacks. The creatures are very cool. Just a couple things to note. One is that the illustrations are really fun and very well done here. And also, check out how concise and cleanly designed those stat blocks are. It's a beautiful thing to see. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that there's an official soundtrack for this game, and it's really good. The artist's name is Greg Illage, and he's put the album up on YouTube, Spotify, Bandcamp, and Apple Music. I'll leave a link below. It's a lot of maybe what I'd describe as modern, electric, ambient rock, all in a major key, so it's kind of bright and uplifting. Happy in a lot of places. Really great ambient music if you plan on running a game of Salvage Union that has those themes. Alright, here are my thoughts on Salvage Union by Leyline Press. No tactics. For better or worse, this is a mech game with minimal tactics. Due to the fact that the game is essentially OSR and wants players to be maximally creative, you don't have things like movement points or even a standard damage reduction mechanic for armor. GM experience required. One of the drawbacks of this OSR approach to gameplay is that you really need a game master who has a feel for a number of different aspects of the RPG experience, including but not limited to what kind of problems and challenges to present, how to improvise rulings properly when there's no rule in place, and overall structure and pacing of a session. To be fair to this game, there is a decent amount of guidance both in the GM section as well as by example in the sample adventure at the end of the book, not to mention the separately published adventure books, which each offer tons of ideas for different challenges at the very least. Simplicity leads to storytelling. My chief complaint with Lancer, and something a lot of people cited as the reason they bounced off that game so hard, was that it offered too many mech options and overemphasized mech combat while not really providing much in the way of out-of-mech play. It's ironic because the Lancer core rulebook is just chock full of setting lore and details, But absolutely none of that matters to players because they're really just in their mechs fighting other mechs the whole time. Salvage Union is the answer to this problem. The dead simple rules allow people to jump right in and tell fun stories rather than get jammed up on tech licenses and complicated loadouts. Shallow but wide. As much as the rules are relatively shallow, the amount of pilot abilities and mech systems and modules is pretty extensive. This makes for a game that isn't entirely a storytelling game. It still has some meat for players to chew on in terms of options that allow them to manifest specific playstyles. Cool presentation. The cover is a great homage to the old Haynes owner's manuals, if you're not familiar, and internally, the layout and architecture of the book is second to none. It's really cleanly presented with tons of artwork that almost all complements each other. I wouldn't say that the aesthetic of all the illustrations is completely unified, but it's not jarring either. Lots of mechs. 30 mechs is a lot, and the authors went so far as to make 3 variant loadouts for each. I would need to go over each one carefully to really confirm this, but my guess is that these 90 mech variants probably cover almost every kind of mech you would want to see as a player. That probably wouldn't be the case if this game were a crunchier mech simulator, but it's softer and mechs aren't necessarily the main star of the show. Also, there's nothing stopping you from making a mech of your own. I think I've gone on long enough about Salvage Union. Let me know in the comments if you've played this one or what your thoughts are on this approach to mechs compared to other mech RPGs. I've left links for everything below. Thanks for watching. See ya.